Hey guys, so for this video, I'm gonna do this a little differently than what I have been the last couple videos. This is gonna be a story about one of my past travel adventures, and the reason I'm doing this is we're coming up on the month of March at the time of recording anyway, and it's about 4 years since the Big C or the Big Cough, whatever you want to call it, took place, and every time it comes up, it's kind of a where were you moment, at least in America anyway. And I've heard a lot of Americans tell their stories of what they were doing at the time things started shutting down back in 2020. But I have a more unique story that I'd like to share with you guys today since this is a travel channel and kind of give you an idea of what I was going through at the time and what it took for me to get back. Because honestly, it's still one of the top three wildest travel stories I have experienced in my life. So I thought it might be something interesting to look back on. So I haven't decided if this is going to be one part or a two-part video. I'm going to see how the recording flows, but sit back, relax, and let's get started. So I think in order to provide some context to this story, we have to go back to the beginning a little bit. So we're going to date this back to January 2020. That's when I first started traveling for that year. And I had some ambitious goals for my 2020 travel year at that time. So back then, I was working in the United States. My work was kind of slow. I was teaching English and doing some freelance reporting at the time. And teaching English was online, so I could take that with me wherever I went. But it was only like part-time hours, and it wasn't really enough to live on in the United States. And also, like, I didn't feel like either of those things I was doing was a long-term career. Like the freelance reporting, I was working for a local newspaper at the time. So at the end of the 2019 calendar year, I told the editor of my newspaper I need to take a step back. I don't feel like this. I didn't say this to him, but like it wasn't earning enough money for me to dedicate my whole career to it. I felt like I was at a point in my life where I needed to reevaluate some things. So I had decided I had enough savings at the time where I was going to take a year to figure things out and travel mostly throughout Southeast Asia. But I had went to Iceland the year prior, so I did have one thing in mind before I settled in Southeast Asia for a year. I did want to go to Norway and mainly go to Svalbard, which I had heard is the much less touristy version of Iceland, or had a lot less tourists. So January 2020, I was finalizing everything, and I was going to start my adventure in Oslo. About a week before I left, my dad and I were having a conversation, watching the local news and national news, really, and we had started hearing about the Big C mainly in China at that time. It might have gotten around in small doses in Asia, but it wasn't really in Europe and the United States at the time. It was an issue in China by the time I was getting ready to leave for Norway, and my dad had a conversation with me one night and asked me like, "Are you sure you want to travel right now? The Big C is getting a little more serious out in China." And naively at the time, I responded to him like, "I'm not afraid. I don't It's really only in China. I'm not really planning on going there." And truthfully, I really wasn't concerned about it. I think most Americans felt the same way at that time, not realizing it was about to become a global problem. So I decided to carry on my travels, and at the time I had went to Norway, spent a couple of days in Oslo, then I went up to Svalbard for a week. Actually met a Chinese girl up there at the time, and she was even joking about it, like, "Don't worry, I don't have the Big C or whatever." And I wasn't really that paranoid at the time. I mean, I only met her because we were staying in the same hotel, and that area had something where you could really only take a public bus to get to where you needed to go. So I talked to her like my first day a little bit, and I don't think either of us were really that worried about it at the time. So this was at the end of January of 2020. We keep going, and I eventually get back to Oslo and I fly over to Thailand. Now, at the time, I had been planning to spend 2 months in Thailand before I needed to leave for a visa run, and my game plan was to spend the rest of the calendar year exploring Southeast Asia, mainly basing in Thailand, but making my way through other countries each time I needed to make a visa run, such as I remember Cambodia and Singapore being big on my list. I wanted to get to those on my first two visa runs. Then, and Thailand had a rule where you could only really stay, not a strict rule, but it was like an unwritten rule where unless you got a more serious visa, you couldn't spend more than like 6 months of the calendar year there before they would start giving you a hard time about coming back. So I had planned to go to neighboring countries when that became a problem in Thailand. Um, I I got to Thailand at the time, and I was spending a few weeks there. Like my first month went pretty smoothly. I watched the Super Bowl out there, and I was really starting to discover it a little bit. This was my first visit too, so I was taking everything in. I had met a few people there, including making a friend with an expat or two, and that expat had a little more experience than me in the country, so he was giving me some good tips. And we hung out a few times in Bangkok, but I eventually grew tired of the city. This was still my first trip to Thailand, so I really wanted to get to the more nature-oriented parts of the country as well. So after spending a few weeks in Bangkok to save a little money, I started hopping around some islands. I got to Koh Samets where I ended up spending a week. Nothing really too notable there, but then I went to Koh Chang, and that's when things started developing. This was really in the middle of March at the time, so I things were starting to escalate with this. By then, it had spread to Europe, and it had just started hitting the United States, I would say. I started hearing about it when I first got to Koh Chang, which is like early mid March, from my American friends. They were telling me it was starting to become a problem in America, or it was starting to be more serious. And my visa in Thailand was about to expire at the end of the month, so I was trying to plan on going somewhere else to make a visa run. What I noticed this becoming a lot more serious was that my options for the visa run were getting quite limited, because what had been happening was neighboring countries in Southeast Asia were starting to shut their borders down. I don't remember the first country to really do it, but I think Vietnam and the Philippines were notably restrictive at that time. I had been hearing about some serious quarantine cases in both countries, while Thailand, quite fortunately for me, was operating as usual. Whereas if I had been in one of those other two countries I just mentioned, I don't know if I would have been able to get out so easily. At least not right away. Um, Thailand really took a while to shut down. For those of you that don't know, they were, I don't want to say they were liberal about it, but they really waited till every other country started to shut down. And that was quite fortunate for me. So, and I'll explain why later. Um, I've been talking, this expat friend of mine from Bangkok put me in touch with a couple of other expats living around Southeast Asia. And these guys had a lot more experience and roots in that part of the world than I did. And I had just started out there for like a month or two at that point. So I didn't really have any long term roots to really camp out in case, stuff hit the fan. They did, and they elected to stay in Southeast Asia throughout the Big C, and I commend them for it. Unfortunately, I really wasn't in a position at the time where I could do it, and I'll explain that a little later. Um, so things were getting a little more serious around Southeast Asia. One guy that had lived in Bali for several years basically told me if Singapore and Malaysia start shutting down, expect every other country to do so, and that's when you really need to take notice. So I had kept my eye on Singapore. That was still open at the time when Vietnam and the Philippines, I believe, were closed. Then I don't remember the exact date, but sometime in the middle of March, Singapore shut down, Malaysia shut down, and I'm like, okay, now I know this is serious. Then it became time to make a real decision about this, because I had been a little stubborn. I had wanted to continue my journey throughout Southeast Asia, and Honestly, there were no real tourists on the on the islands at the time. Both Koh Samet and Koh Chan, the locals were telling me, yeah, there's not a lot of tourists right now. I think people are afraid of the big sea or not able to get out and travel because some of the Asian countries in the north were also closed at the time due to the big sea. Um, yeah, I think I knew it was about to get really serious, and at the time, we did not know exactly how this was going to play out. Um, I I didn't feel like I had enough roots in Southeast Asia to really plan a long term camp there because my friends even told me you better be prepared to stay 6 months or a year if you're going to stay here and not be able to leave the country. So I was facing the decision of do I camp out in Thailand or do I go back to the United States? And going back to the United States was a bit of a scary prospect at the time because one of the epicenters of the Big C was New York at the time, and I would have to fly in through there. And I felt like I was going to the nucleus of the Big C if I were to choose to fly back. My sister even told me you might be safer out on an island at the because I was in a remote island that you need to take a ship to get to. So she said, if this really ends up being serious, you might be safer out there. But I think my problem is I had no access to resources if I wasn't able to stay in a long term accommodation. Because at the time, I had heard stories from neighboring countries about kicking out foreigners or not letting foreigners stay in a hotel or an apartment, and I was a little scared of that possibility because I didn't have anything set up like some of my friends out there did. So I started talking to my family, started talking to my friends back home, and I think they all urged me to go home. They all urged me that hey, this is getting pretty serious. You need to come home and or you should come home, and that way you at least have a roof over your head and somewhere and are familiar with, and have access to more resources and more people you trust. Because honestly, in an apocalyptic scenario, you never know what people will do out there. So it it was a very irrational time. I'll put it that way. So I had been thinking about it a lot. I was staying in Koh Chan for about a week at the time. I had planned to stay about one more week, and then one more week after that in Thailand before I hopped the border, or took a flight to do a visa run. Well, after talking to my family, talking to my friends who had lived in Southeast Asia a long time, I eventually made the decision while I was in Koh Chang to make my way back to the United States, and I was gonna make my way back to the United States, and I knew it was gonna be a very long journey because I was in the other side of the world at the time. It was gonna be very difficult, but I just ended up deciding, like literally that day, that hey, I'm gonna get the next flight out from Bangkok, and I looked online, saw what was available, saw prices. Luckily for me, prices were pretty reasonable. I don't think too many people were flying at the time, so it really did not cost me a lot of money to fly the next day compared to the normal rates. I paid about the average it would cost to fly home. So I booked a flight. I booked the next flight available, and that flight ended up being the next night. So I think it was about 24 hours from when I booked it. So I basically had 24 hours to get back to Bangkok, and that was going to be a journey. And that's when things got really interesting. And I'm going to leave it at there. In part two, I'll discuss my journey about how I got back home from the United States and how long that took me and how difficult it was. Thanks for watching, guys. See you in part two.